Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute presentations, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, economy, communities, and families. Today, Joe Horner joins us to speak about renewable electricity. Before I invite him to begin, though, I do want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close today with a Q&A session. If you connected today via your computer, then you may submit your questions in the chat screen. If you joined today by phone, then you may email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's presentation, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. And last, we will make a recording of today's presentation available. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access the recording sometime tomorrow, and we'll also make a copy of the slides available in that email. You can also find an archive of all of our previous webinars on our Division of Applied Social Sciences YouTube channel. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's presentation, which is titled Renewable Electricity Transitions, Implications for Rural Missouri. Presenting today is Joe Horner, who's an agricultural economist with University of Missouri Extension and the MU Division of Applied Social Sciences. So thanks, Joe, for presenting today. If you could go ahead and unmute your microphone, then we can begin today's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alice. And thank you all for joining us today for this discussion of renewable energy transitions and some of the implications for rural Missouri. First of all, I'll start off with just an advertisement for a new publication we've just released called Distributed Energy Resources, a primer for Missouri farmers. There's a link in the bottom of the page here, and I think we'll put that in the chat for anybody who's interested in downloading the free publication. It's our effort to create sort of a Reader's Digest version of information about what's happening in the way electricity is generated, transmitted, and distributed, and why that is occurring. And there's a huge amount of information available on state and federal websites and a lot of different advocacy groups. Our effort is just to combine it down, distill it down to a Reader's Digest version so that rural landowners who encounter these issues can get themselves up to speed quickly and figure out where they want to dive in to the issue. Renewable energy, the implications for rural Missouri. Let's start with the most obvious. Renewable energy, wind and solar tend to be land extensive, and so it tends to be generated and transmitted out in rural areas where we have a lot of land. Missouri's renewable build-out has a long runway ahead. If you look at the percentage of our electricity mix that's coming currently from coal, and you look at the integrated resource plans that are on file with the Missouri Public Service Commission from the investor-owned utilities in Missouri, you can see that over the next 5 to 10 years, we have hundreds of megabytes of new wind and solar planned for the state. Whether that's produced in the state or produced out of state and transmitted here will be an interesting issue to watch. Farmers currently have on-farm investment opportunities on their side of the meter. We have more landowners who are going to be encountering wind and solar lease opportunities than I have in the past. With each of these comes financial risks and rewards and potential land use conflicts, just to be honest. Let's take a look at the big picture about renewable electricity. It's really just another link in the chain that connects our agricultural economy with the energy economy. And we've seen that develop with the ethanol industry, where we're now using about a third of our corn acreage to produce liquid biofuels. We've seen that with our biodiesel industry, where we've increased demand for soybean oil as a feedstock for the biodiesel industry. Now with the buildup of the renewable diesel industry, we're going to expand the use of soybean oil as a feedstock for liquid fuels. We've seen wind farms expanding to the north and to the west of us into parts of Missouri, and now we're beginning to see the start of utility scale solar in Missouri. So we're looking at the implications of this. And one of the questions that I think a lot of people ask is, what is driving this? One of the key drivers is just the fact that wind and utility scale solar costs have come down over the last decade to the point where if you're looking at new generation capacity, wind and solar are competitive with fossil fuel and traditional conventional fuel plants. This diagram kind of shows the min and max costs for new generation facilities. As you can see on the left-hand side, the onshore wind is one of the lower cost utility scale solar than combined cycle gas, coal, battery storage, nuclear, and then at the high end of the cost structure is residential solar. Keep in mind, residential solar doesn't have to compete as a low-cost generation of electricity because it's, for the most part, displacing residential retail priced electricity, and it also has some subsidies that we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is an unsubsidized look at the different new generation sources of electricity. Those black stars that you see there are what it costs to maintain and run and pay for the fuel for existing plants that already sunk investments in place. So you can see combined cycle gas, coal plants, and nuclear plants are, as long as they last at the end of their lifetime, those are some of the most competitive pricing of existing electricity sources. But when we start talking about adding electricity or replacing those plants, then we look at the cost structure of what the next generation facility is going to cost. Keep in mind, utilities have a large mandate to maintain reliability and affordability. We talked about Missouri having a long runway ahead for the transition into more and more renewables. And one of the things that gives us a little confidence of that is simply to look at the percentage of our current electricity mix that is coming from coal. Missouri is one of the top 3 states in terms of our usage of coal. In 2020, we were at 63% of our electricity mix coming from coal, as against the national average of about 17.3%. Every state and every region of the country has a different mix based on the legacy of decisions made and what the best resources at the time was. And plants tend to have ultra long lives compared to a lot of other things we're used to. And also utilities, the engineers, the planners who have to plan utility have to be thinking 5, 10, 20, even 40 years out to maintain that reliability and affordability. So let's look at how we are compared to our surrounding states. And this graphic just shows the percentage of electricity used that came from wind and solar in 2020. As you can see, Iowa was leading the pack at about 57.5% of the electricity coming from wind and solar. And to be honest with you, almost most of that is wind. Iowa's windy. There's some other reasons why it's had some fast development of the wind up there. Nebraska at 23%, Kansas at 43%, Oklahoma at 35%. Missouri, percentage of our electricity usage coming from wind and solar is about 4.8%. Illinois is 10%. To the south and to the east of us, you'd see less, but certainly to the west and north of us, the wind generation has taken over a major portion of the electricity mix. If we look at what's been going on this last year with new plants coming online, you can see the size of the bubble there. Tells you the size of the new generating capacity coming online. And the color of the bubble tells you whether it was wind, if it's green, or solar, if it's yellow. And then we've got some little blue lines coming in from the battery storage and some lighter blue from natural gas and one big nuclear plant in Georgia. I call your attention to a couple things. One is solar plants tend to be smaller than wind. They tend to be able to stick in different places. And there is a proliferation of solar across the country. It's not just a West Coast thing or an East Coast thing. A lot of Texas solar is coming in, a lot of wind in Oklahoma. And actually, the research articles that I read said that about 20%, 25% of the time, Oklahoma had negative wholesale electricity prices in 2020, partly due to just the massive build out and of wind, and the production tax credits said that they wouldn't shut down And in 2020, we're backed off demand a little bit. So we've built some wind and solar to the point where negative wholesale electricity prices occur parts of the year. Just a little bit of a repeat of something we talked about 2 weeks ago in the Engage from Reserve section with Dr. Mike Sakuda talked about the way utilities are priced. But the 3 parts of bringing electricity to your home are generation and transmitting that high voltage across the country to a distribution network that distributes it up and down the roads and to your individual transformer and to your individual house. And each one of these has a cost involved with it, and there are also different entities involved with this. The one thing people are most familiar with is the utility that they write their electric checks to. So when they get the utility bill at the end of the month, they tend to write a check to their utility. That tends to be the distribution utility. That if you're a rural electric co-op or a municipal utility, they buy electricity off the grid, they sell it to you, they invest a large fixed cost in the distribution network, and they make a little bit off of each electron that they transmit across their distribution. There's a transmission, a massive cost in moving electricity across the country, and then there's the generation cost that we talked about earlier on what it costs to generate electricity. We may have regulated utilities, regulated monopoly investor-owned firms that own all pieces of this. People would be familiar with Ameren, Evergy, Liberty, that may own all pieces of this. And we may have pieces that you aren't familiar with that own the generating capacity. They may be merchant generators, maybe project developers, both in the generation and in the transmission system. If we're talking about the transmission system, it's important to understand that Missouri sits with basically 3 different transmission operations. The 2 independent system operators are the MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and the Southwest Power Pool to the west. These are managed as nonprofits to manage the wholesale interstate movement of electricity, to price it, to maintain reliability, to maintain the gate, if you will, on who gets to transmit power across it. And it is organized for open access, but when somebody wants to bring in new power, they have to submit an interconnect request. And just to bring up the point of how important renewables are seen in the future, within MISO, 92% of the new interconnect requests are coming from wind, solar, or hybrid. And within Southwest Power Pool, 95% of the new interconnect requests are coming in from solar, wind, or hybrid. Now, a question becomes if we can shift gears now and start talking about the big picture and start talking about the little picture on farm or on resident investments that you can make on your side of the meter. Missouri has a Net Metering and Easy Connect Act. There's the statute. It basically says that up to 100 kilowatt system, you can put that in and you can displace the electricity you've been buying off your distribution grid. And when you do that, you displace buying it at retail price. And then if you produce more at any one time than you are needing, it goes back through your meter to the utility's distribution grid. And the utility has to pay you an avoided cost, their avoided cost for those electrons. And they're settled up at the end of the billing period. Some utilities may have may have a better situation than that for their users, but that is where the legislation is. In the 2022 legislative session, as there was in last year's legislation session, there is a bill to create a task force to review this net metering law. And I would tell you that across the country, net metering laws are in flux a little bit because as we develop more rooftop solar, and that becomes more of a portion of our electricity, legislation is looking at that because we want to make sure that we can maintain the reliability and the affordability of the customers who don't put rooftop solar on their farm, on their roofs. And keep in mind that in farmers, typically we talk about rooftop solar, but on farm and rural areas, we typically don't have to put it on top of the roof. We put it out behind the barn where it's a little bit lower cost and easier to maintain to put ground mounts up. But the landowner is responsible for the investment and maintenance of those facilities. The reason that we're seeing more of them is because the cost has come down in recent years, and when you stack on the solar tax credit at 26% for federal income tax purposes for 2022, and then for farmers at least, or rural businesses, there are grants available from USDA on the Rural Energy for America program grants that can add another 25%. And solar is exempt from property taxes under Missouri legislation currently. Shifting gears back to farmers beyond their meter, what opportunities exist? Wind leasing is becoming a bigger thing across the United States. This is a map of Northwest Missouri and St. Joe, and each one of those little dots is a windmill and a different wind farm. But they've gone from like 1 to 1.5 megawatts to up to 2.5 megawatt facilities. They tend to be located in windy sites. So we've got now wind farms in Northeast Missouri and Southwest Missouri, in addition to the ones that have been there longer in Northwest. Wind farms tend to be 100, 600 megawatts. They produce enough electricity you can afford to run a transmission line to them, and it's very localized where the wind is optimal. They tend to have a big visual impact. They tend to be land extensive across a large chunk of land, but they're not exclusive use. You can farm around them. You can continue to use your farm. One windmill per 160 acres is about as dense as they get. And for our purposes of just showing this, it's up to individual negotiation, of course. But if you consider a $10,000 a year annual lease on windmill, you'd be pretty close to average across the country. Solar leasing, if we look at solar leasing, is a little different. It tends to be localized to the transmission line and substation proximity. They tend to be not as energy dense, and they tend to be to not want to have to pay for a lot of new transmission capacity to them. So they tend to want to locate close to existing uncongested transmission lines and close to substations already, where they can wheel power and sell it and move it where it's needed. Solar parks, 200 to 300 megawatt are typical across the country. We haven't seen the biggest ones yet in Missouri, but there are some planned. They tend to be exclusive use of smaller acreage sizes. In other words, you're not farming around them, you're building a wall around them, and they're operated like a utility. 1 megawatt, if you consider the setback distances and the way our land forms in Missouri, you're typically thinking about 7 acres per megawatt. An estimate for 1 megawatt is about $1 million capital investment. And if you're talking about the landowner's fraction of that, an annual lease about $500 to $1,500 an acre would capture most of the annual leases on solar farms. Here's just a snapshot to answer some questions people may have about what the potential Missouri solar build out might look like. This is not a projection. This is not based on where we can tell things are going. This is simply based on trying to answer a question. If we try to meet 1% of our electric needs, 10%, 20%, and 30% of our electric needs, how many megawatts of capacity would we need of solar? What capital investment that would look like, and how many acres that would use. And at $500 an acre, how much lease income would that put into rural Missouri? How much lease income it would put in at $1,000 an acre? And you know, our estimate here for going up to 30%, which is probably the maximum we'd see over the next 10, 20 years, it would be about 123,000 acres in this example. And there are some states east of us that are getting approaching tens of thousands of acres. So it's not totally out of the realm. Keep in mind, Missouri has 785,000 acres last fall in conservation reserve program. We have about 28 million acres in total cropland in Missouri. And there are also, EPA had already identified for 2,300 brownfield sites across that could potentially be used for renewable energy development. If we look at the farm perspective, this farm family's view of renewable energy lease is the first time they may think about it is when somebody knocks on their door and puts a proposal in front of them. And farm finances can definitely improve with some of the lease income. It can be very significant. On solar leases, it could be 5 to 10 times what their annual lease would be like for cropping. So it definitely gets their attention. Some of the issues that pop up are local competition for land lease and for purchase. People, if they lease some of their existing cropland for solar, then they're going to turn around and want to either rent or purchase land to crop on. There's conflicting generational goals. The younger generation may absolutely not want to give up 1 acre for their farming operation. They may be scrambling to get enough acres to continue to operate in the next generation, versus the older generation on that same farm may look at this as an opportunity to pass the farm on to the children and also generate a retirement income. So there's different time horizons for the different family members. And never discount the impact on neighbors in rural areas, because rural areas, you tend to live and die by your neighborhood relations, and can impact how the neighbors see you. One role we haven't talked about when we're talking about utilities, and we've talked about the investor-owned utilities, the municipals, the rural electric co-ops. There's a new role that people may not have been familiar with, and that's the project developers roles. These tend to be specialized companies that tend to do projects and build out wind and solar parks across the country. They have the engineering talent, they have the expertise, they have the industry connections. And typically what they will do is select a site and then go around and secure options to lease the land. And they'll typically secure an option significantly more land than they actually will lease. They secure the permits if needed for planning and zoning in the county. They will secure the interconnect request with the independent system operator. They will find a purchaser and the power and execute a purchase power agreement, either with a existing utility or with a commercial or industrial customer where they can wheel power across the transmission network and sell it to a purchase buying agreement to a remote buyer. They will find financing for the project, and then they will go out and secure those land leases that may be 25, 30, up to 40 years. They will engineer the design, build the project, and then they may hold it, or they may sell it to a utility or to another company that's investing in these blocks and repeat that same business model. So in summary, I guess Reader's Digest version is photovoltaics and wind are becoming a cheaper form of new electricity generation. There are government policies that may speed or slow this transition, but the renewable technology is what is causing this to cross a cost threshold with fossil fuels that is making it more and more viable, both on your side of the meter and for the investors or the utility scale parks. The transition is probably going to impact more rural Missouri over the next 5, and 10-year timeframes. Transition will seem gradual, but it will be increasingly noticeable. And in the resources there, I just point to some resources if people are looking to dig deeper. Missouri is not at the forefront of either solar or wind. There are states that have gone through this in a much bigger way, and there are some really good resources already out there. The Ohio State has a really nice utility scale solar piece that goes through all the things a person would want to look at if they're thinking about a solar lease on their property. The National Ag Law Center at the University of Arkansas has a number of webinars and publications on wind and solar from a landowner's perspective. And also the National Renewable Energy Lab has a nice piece on best management practices for zoning for solar parks. So with that, Alice, I think I'll wrap up the formal section and be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Joe. If you do have questions, we do still have some time, so you can add those in the chat screen, or you can also send them via email to me at roacham@missouri.edu. Joe, in the chat while you were speaking, there was some conversation about how you can integrate grazing into solar systems. but maybe that sheep and goats would be preferable relative to cattle. Have you heard of anyone doing this, or do you have any insights with respect to that topic?
Yes, there are a number of efforts, they call it agrivoltaics. And basically there are a number of efforts of either specialty crops or livestock and small ruminants, particularly sheep and goats, underneath for vegetation control, and also to combine agriculture with the solar facilities. I would caution people that are thinking about that to realize that a utility is putting over $100,000 an acre into solar panels, racking, inverters, and those kind of things. And we're talking about fairly minor productivity off that ground compared to electricity production. So the interest of the utility or the project developer in combining that may not be there. And since they're writing the checks, they probably have the most decisions to make on that thing. So most leases that I've seen have been, in Missouri at least, have been exclusive use of that acreage. Not to say it couldn't in the future evolve that way. There's opportunities to bring in pollinators in the mix. There's opportunities to use some things if there's public pushback against the land coming out of agriculture.
Great, thank you for those points. Another question here reads, in your research, did you hear of any companies that are using or looking to use biodiesel, either B20 or higher, for industrial turbines or backup generators?
That's a good question. And I guess I'm probably not in a position to answer it. I know we've looked at using biodiesel on a lot of marine applications simply because in sensitive areas, it is, if you have a spill, biodiesel, 100% biodiesel is a lot more environmentally friendly to the environment than fossil diesel. The big issue on biodiesel right now is the rollout, the planned expansion of the renewable diesel facilities around the country coming online as oil companies tie up with soybean crushers to guarantee a feedstock supply, because with the low carbon fuel standards on the West Coast, it's become much more profitable to produce renewable diesel. And that is putting a price pressure on soybean oil to raise it. So it's soybean oil is a feedstock of choice for the biodiesel and renewable diesel industry, and they're competing for that feedstock.
Great, thank you. Another question here reads, what are the common aspects of these leases? Are they based on solar production or are they fixed?
They're fixed. And probably one of the things that I would caution people to think about, if they're used to thinking about farm leases, we're used to talking about an annual lease. These are very long-term leases. They're more like an industrial lease. And there are some nice materials in the resources I shared on the things to think through on those leases. The common things are, of course, define the property, define what can be used for the property, defining how you're going to take care of it. But the important pieces of it, besides defining how you're paid, which is typically on an annual basis, but defining liability, and that's typically in the boilerplate that the company is putting together, is responsible for liability, but also the end of life, how that reverts and who's responsible for the cleanup or takedown, and any provisions to extend that lease. It's really important before anybody signs that first option to lease that they understand the entire contract that they're going to be looking at, and they get somebody, an attorney or somebody that's used to looking over solar leases, to help them understand the implications.
Excellent. Well, it's time to close today's webinar. Thanks, Joe, for presenting and for taking our questions, and thanks to our audience for joining us. A post-webinar survey will either have loaded in your browser already, or it will pop up soon when you close Zoom. Please consider responding to that survey, as we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via email within about a day from now, and we'll also include a link where you can go to download today's slides. Please consider joining us for our next Engaging for Missouri webinar on May 4th. Dr. Willie Myers, who's a professor emeritus of agricultural and applied economics, will speak about Ukraine's growing role in global agriculture and possible impacts of conflict. Again, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy your Wednesday. Thanks again, Joe.